The next technology, actually the last one that I encountered in Pegasus, was called a plasma confinement chamber. It was basically a chamber about, maybe again about the size of this room, and there was a line on the floor, and we were told that when we walked past the line and into the plasma that was under confinement, there was this opalescent kind of swirls of gaseous, kind of cloudy looking material that was swirling around on the other side of the chamber. We would begin falling and wormhole to a past event. But when that quantum field effect wore off, we'd have this massive Kundalini sensation and be back in the laboratory. So because teleportation couldn't reach the distant past, because the teleporters didn't exist yet, they had developed chronovision and this plasma confinement technology to get us to the distant past. Well, where did they send me? They sent me to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania on November 19th of 1863. Here I am right here, and Abraham Lincoln is over my right shoulder here in a few pixels that were discovered by Josephine Cobb at the Library of Congress in 1951 in a cache of photographs that was either collected by the famous Civil War photographer Matthew Brady or was actually, we don't know, but we think they were actually possibly Brady photographs. I had been dropped off. I'll just try to do this just spatially because I don't have the maps done on this yet, but this is, we're looking at the dais where everybody has now gathered with the Gettysburg Cemetery behind it. The Gettysburg downtown is over here. The downtown was reached by a north-south arterial that went this direction, and then there was a road that went northwest, about an hour walk or 45-minute walk along that north-south road. So when I stepped into the field of plasma, as my father had described, I wormholed for about 30 seconds. Again, I was running out of air, through these branching wormholes in kind of an amber-colored medium that we call the quantum plenum. It's kind of like the ground of the quantum hologram. In other words, I was being physically dropped into the past. And I popped into view along the side of the road. My dad said, just start walking in one direction or not along the road that we send you to, and call out to the first person that you see walking on the road and say, hey friend, which way Gettysburg? But when I popped into view, and the wormholing stopped and I was feverish, I could smell a little ozone, just like I could when we were Tesla teleporting, but kind of my head was kind of spinning a little bit, I felt feverish. I pop into view and I realized that my hat, both of my shoes and one of my socks was wrenched off in the wormholing because of the turbulence involved, because of the ferocity of the wormholing. So I sat down and took off the other sock and threw it in some scrub-like type bushes. It was November there, so there's already a lot of leaves missing in the East Coast, in Pennsylvania. I then started walking along this well-trammeled dirt road. It must have been trammeled by the Union or Confederate troops. I saw a very tall and gaunt, maybe 19-year-old Union soldier, private, walking along the road, and I yelled out, hey friend, which way Gettysburg? And he stopped in his tracks, squared off his shoulders in the direction we were both walking, and went like this, which I thought was pretty, good show of courtesy. I then walked for about 45 minutes down that north side road, maybe a half hour, seeing farmhouses and homes, farm home buildings and barns and things like this. I'm thinking, am I really going to find Gettysburg here? And it was cold. It was foggy at first, and then the fog was starting to wear off as I'm walking, but it was still very cold, so that by the time I got into Gettysburg, my teeth were chattering. And I went up into what must have been the downtown area, but all it was is you'd have 2 or 3 or 5 shops as common elements of the same building, and then a wooden sidewalk in front of those shops, and then the sidewalk would end. So again, dirt with the wooden sidewalks like I had encountered near Ford's Theater, or outside of Ford's Theater. I'm looking through the window, and let's see if we can jump ahead here a little bit. Yeah, I'm going to jump ahead just for the heck of it here. I'm jumping through, I'm looking through the window, and I hear this man walk up onto the wooden sidewalk, and he's about 70 years old. He had kind of a sour expression, almost like a mean look. And he was limping like this, like he had been shot in the hip, like really limping, even making noise limping as he walked across the sidewalk. And he said, boy, what are you doing out in this cold weather this morning? You're going to catch the grip, son. Let me take you inside and get you a jacket. I'll get you some shoes. Get you warm, or something to that effect. But basically, He told me I was going to catch my grip if I stayed out in the cold with chattering teeth. And so he pulled out one of those skeleton keys. So he had access to the millinery shop, which is some men's accessories, hats, shoes, ties, walking stick, gloves, socks, and so forth. And he helped me. He voluntarily helped me. As I said, he had a key to the shop. He took me right to the back of the shop, and he took the biggest, most weathered civilian street shoes off of the shelf of used shoes on the back of the shop. Not with the fancy hats and ties and stick pins and all that stuff in the front. This was the used shoe rack at the back of the shop. And he was, just like he was, a modern, person working in a shoe store, he basically was shoving packing paper into the front of the shoes and fitting my foot inside the shoe. And he gave me shoes. That's the first thing he focused on, was shoes, even though my teeth were chattering and I clearly needed a jacket. He then took me into the storeroom behind the main floor of the shop and quickly reached into the stack of coats and pulled out a relatively small Union winter parka. I think it was probably the medium size for that generation of adult men. And it fit perfectly as a taller, more corpulent 10-year-old from 1972. He then said, "Oh, that fits perfectly. Sorry about the shoes," or something. And he then said, "Well, young man, I've helped you as much as I can. The President of the United States is going to be here today, and I've got a speech to go to." And he hobbled out of the shop. Actually, I missed a point of this, which was the woman who apparently owned the millinery shop, and I haven't done any research on her, so I'm mentioning this woman intentionally. What would seem to be the proprietress of the shop came in and challenged why he was helping me. But as they were conversing, I had this quantum fluctuation where everything was speeding up and then slowing down. And I heard nothing of what she said to him, although I think she was saying, "What are you doing giving our stuff away to this young, street urchin?" She probably said, "To this carpetbagger," or whatever. Because I was dressed as a Union bugle boy, had been outfitted in the jersey and pants and shoes and hat, not the bugle. And I said, "Well, are you going to give me a trumpet?" And she said, "No, your file says you play saxophone, right? Well, I'm not going to give you a trumpet, because if we give you a trumpet, first of all, it's metal, and we don't want that going with you, because of what might happen to the metal. But also, somebody might ask you to play your bugle, and you're not going to be able to. So we're not going to give you a bugle. Tell them you lost it during a battle if you're challenged about why you don't have a bugle." But at this point, I'm sort of like a half-dressed Union bugle boy, because I've lost my shoes and my socks. I walked in barefoot and my hat. So he outfitted me with a hat, a jacket, and shoes, and I'm not sure even if he included socks. So I still have to do more research on who the lady was. In fact, I'll try to search whether the millinery shop in downtown Gettysburg had a female proprietress, and then we'll be able to identify her by name. I talked about the fact that this guy was 70 years old, that he had a sour expression, that he was limping from a recent wound to his hip, that he voluntarily helped me, that he went right into the shop with a skeleton key in that men's clothing store and right to the shoes before I found out who he was. He was a man by the name of John Lawrence Burns, who was born in 1793, 70 years before 1863. He had a characteristic sour expression, just I guess as a result of having a hard life, a kind of a rugged, fixed kind of grimace on his face, as you can see in this and other pictures. Not that bad, but it's definitely a character trait. And he had been shot after volunteering into the Union Army when the Battle of Gettysburg swept past his town. He picked up his gun, which we can see here, and was shot by Confederate forces in the hip, and was then surrendered under a flag of surrender to Union forces, and went back to his life as a civilian. Well, when I encountered him 4 months later, you've got a 70-year-old recovering from a musket ball shot to the hip. Guess what? He was limping. But where had he left his crutches? Well, back at his house. Where was his house? This gentleman who I had already talked about, it's like 8:15 in the morning in Gettysburg on November 19th of 1863. He actually leapt onto the wooden sidewalk like he had just walked down the street from his house and was confronting me at the millinery shop where he sold shoes. Well, John Lawrence Burns' house was 2 blocks from the downtown business district of Gettysburg. And we're talking those small Pennsylvania rural blocks. So he had actually come like 150 feet from his house to the millinery shop. That was his domain, because what was he professionally? A cobbler. Now, I had talked about all these elements, even describing his physical appearance, before I found him in the historical database. Who was he? He was one of the first volunteers to the War of 1812 in his late teens, and one of the only civilian Pennsylvanians who had volunteered his service at age 69 back in July of 1863 into the Battle of Gettysburg. So I'm just jumping forward in terms of using this to show sort of the internested facts that I'm not creative enough to make up. Okay? And this is one of the good proofs, because while Abraham Lincoln was a prominent historical personage, John Lawrence Burns wasn't. I mean, he's clearly enough in the Civil War literature to be searchable, but he's a relatively obscure historical figure. I don't even think they've made a U.S. postage stamp around him.